So now moving on to the second part of this chapter, the budget expenditure. So again, for budget expenditure, we've got two subparts: revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. Again, revenue being the term coined for something that does not create any asset for the government and also has no role in any reduction of the liability for the government. And capital being which has an effect on the assets and the liability of the government. Talking about the revenue expenditure first, we do not have much of the explanation here in TR Jain. We only have the mention of whatever considers under the revenue expenditure data: wage bill of the government employees, interest payments, expenditure on subsidies and defense purchases. And also it is written that the grants, whatever the center government is providing to the states, the grants are to be considered as revenue expenditure as they do not have the necessity to be repaid, and loans are considered as capital expenditure, which is basically loan by the central government to the state government. It's considered as an asset for the central government as they've given out the loans, lending. So the loans are something that must be repaid, hence and capital expenditure. So now talking about the capital expenditure. Capital expenditure is something that creates, that rises up through the number of assets of the government, and it also causes a reduction in the liability for the government. And again, we've got an important list of all the things that consist as the capital expenditure in the Indian government budget. Expenditure on land and building, on machinery and equipment, purchases of shares and stakes, and loans by the central government to the state government or state corporations, as I have already mentioned. And also, budget expenditure, number one, they can be classified as revenue and revenue expenditure and capital expenditure, and we've also got the classification of planned expenditure and non-planned expenditure. We do not really use them a lot, but planned expenditure consists of specified plans and programs of the central government for development, and secondly, it talks about the assistance of whatever assistance the central government is providing to the state governments in case of emergency, or also like revenue expenditure and capital expenditure, both of them. Revenue in the form of assistance for social services and everything, and capital in the form of aiding in the building of roads and bridges and etc. So next we've got the final estimation of budget expenditure. It consists of budget expenditure is equal to revenue expenditure plus capital expenditure. It can also be said as for the second classification, budget expenditure is equal to planned expenditure plus non-planned expenditure. And also non-planned expenditure is an important part of the Indian government budget, and India, the central government spends a lot of money just for maintaining their non-planned stuff. Oh yeah, non-planned also talks about, non-planned is basically whatever money it takes for the routine function of law and order, maintaining law and order, defense and subsidies in the government. And then we've got, after this, we've got the difference between revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. So revenue expenditure does not really directly impact our GDP, but rather it focuses on social development and welfare of the people. And in contrast, capital expenditure directly affects GDP growth, and it's non-recurring in nature, and the first one was recurring in nature. Like a rise in revenue expenditure results, it points out to the poverty of the people or the backwardness of the economy, and a rise in capital expenditure, it points out towards the lack of private investment, as in the economy is going in a deflationary spin. Then next we've got the difference between revenue budget and capital budget. Revenue budget again does not directly impact the GDP growth, it indirectly impacts, as in it works towards developing the social welfare etc. for the people. And secondly, capital budget talks directly about the GDP or the public investment. A better revenue budget shows a growing economy, and a high capital budget talks about a backward economy because the government has to invest a lot. Now talking about the fourth part of our chapter, budget deficit. In TR Jain, we've been talking about three types of deficits. Number one is the revenue deficit, number two fiscal deficit, number three primary deficit. So revenue deficit is the case where revenue expenditure exceeds revenue receipts, and it can be curbed in the form of borrowing from general public, RBI or rest of the world. Secondly, in the form of disinvestment, which means selling of ownership, the government-owned ownership of shares of public enterprise. And thirdly, in the form of cutting up expenditure, in the form of reducing subsidies or the investment, whatever investment they've got in social schemes like NGNREGA. And then we've got the fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit talks about when total expenditure exceeds total receipts, total expenditure in the form of revenue expenditure and capital expenditure, when that exceeds total receipts in the form of revenue receipts and capital receipts. And this all is except the borrowings, and this whole is known as gross fiscal deficit, and it is the estimation of total borrowing whatever the country has to borrow from RBI, from abroad, and the net borrowing at home, and it is often shown as a percentage of the whole GDP. Now, what are the implications of having a fiscal deficit? It means that the country, if we borrow from RBI, there would be rise in the money supply in the country, which means inflation. Secondly, it also increases the chances of a national debt. It results in a vicious cycle of high fiscal deficit and low GDP growth, as they both go hand in hand. So high fiscal deficit leads to low GDP growth, and again that leads to high fiscal deficit, and the cycle hamster wheel goes on. Then we've got crowding out. It is a situation when the government borrows too much from the public and reduces the availability of loans for private investors, etc. So the whole availability of money in the market, it reduces. Overall investment reduces in the economy. Then lastly, we've got erosion of government credibility. So if the government is going to knock at the doorstep of IMF and every economic organization present worldwide, then obviously the creditness of our government repaying the loans, it decreases, and it's a bad thing for the country. So now, the percentage that is considered to be normal as a fiscal deficit, and it's about 3% of the GDP, that's considered normal. Elsewise, it's considered as a stagnation, and the revival becomes very difficult without FDIs, which are the foreign direct investments. Lastly, we've got the primary deficit. Primary deficit is basically fiscal deficit minus the interest payments. So it talks about the current year expenditure if the current year expenditure exceeds the current year receipts. It shows that government lacks fiscal discipline, and it's not a very positive thing to boast about by the central government. So lastly, we've got the difference between balanced and unbalanced budget. Balanced budget is that budget where government receipts are equal, they're at par with the government expenditure. Well, overall it seems like a good thing, but we've also got some shortcomings, especially if we see the case of the General Depression in 1930s. There was simply the unemployment was linked to the lack of aggregate demand, and hence, like, if the government was not investing more, as in if there was no sign of fiscal deficit, it means the government wasn't really investing a lot in the economy, and it was less proficient. So hence it was not functioning on the proper potential of the economy. So that's not really a good thing, and that's why sometimes the balanced budget, according to the circumstances, is not really a very good thing. Then lastly, we've got the unbalanced budget. Unbalanced budget talks about two things. Either the case can be of a surplus budget where the estimated government receipts exceed the estimated government expenditure, or vice versa, it can be a deficit budget where the estimated government expenditure is more than the estimated government receipts. So in case of surplus budget where receipts are more than expenditure, the merit is that it has a positive effect during inflation, and the demerit is it does not really work in case of deflation. And vice versa for deficit budget, it works in the case of deflation and it does not work in the case of inflation. So that was all about the government budget and the economy, the chapter 10 of the macroeconomics class 12th book, Dr. Jain. Thank you.